welcome to another Sister A video. This one is on the CSS positioning activity. Now looking at this activity, it looks very challenging, and I understand that, but make sure you do all of the other activities in week 6 and do this one last so that you will be able to understand when I say grid that you know what it's talking about. All right, so let's assume you've done all that. You're going to be going here to this activity, and you got to verify at first. You should have two files in there. One is the positioning.html, and it looks like this. It's got a lot of information on it. You won't be changing even one thing on that page. And the other is position styles.css, and that one is where you're going to be making all of your changes. There are 6 activities. All right, so now what is this going to look like? Well, the first thing you need to do is make sure on your index page that you have this link in your index so that you can go to your positioning activity page, positioning.html. All right, and when you push the show button, this is what you should have. What you're going to want to do is see what activity 1 is supposed to look like when you're finished. And this is it. All right, and I can tell by looking at this that this is going to be solved with CSS Grid. Not all of them are, but activity 1 will be. How can I tell that? Well, because it's laid out in rows and columns. So it's 2 columns with a certain amount of gap in between, and each row has a certain amount of gap in between, and you're going to state what the gap should be. Now, how are we going to get there? So it says the first step with using CSS Grid is to identify which elements we're trying to move around, and those are going to be the grid items. Right up here at the very start, it's kind of hard to see because they have all these comments around it, but right here, and I'm going to get rid of this, it says this is the parent of the activity 1 boxes. So I'm going to get rid of that because this is where you're going to put the parent items. Alrighty, and if you look again at the example, notice that the red goes all the way across. It's over both of these, so it's 100%. Only for the red and the blue, we're going to take this px out of the width. We're going to leave it 100 pixels high, or we're going to change this to 100%. Just take the px out and put it as a percent. And then do the same thing for the blue, because we want it to stretch all the way across. The green and the yellow look to be about twice their current size, so we're going to change their height and width to 200 pixels. Okay, so see how we made these 100%? Now they look different. And we want these each to be 200, 200. So let's go back over to the code, and we're going to change each of these for yellow and green. We're going to make those 200 and 200, and the same thing for the yellow, 200 and 200. Now, it won't do us any good if we don't turn on the grid, and that's going to be apparent up here. So we're going to go display grid. Don't forget, it's CSS, so everything ends with a semicolon. And the next thing, it says we're going to define at least the columns of the grid. We need to know need before anything else happens. So now we have to kind of display them as grid template columns. And you can just take this, actually this whole statement here, and copy it and bring it back over here to your content of one. And now you have what we're going to be defining. So we're going to go 1 FR and then a space and then 1 FR. Now that indicates that there's 2 columns. We're going to say that just so the red will stay in its place, we're going to also add to that, and I'll do it up here above the color, we're going to add to that that it's a grid column from 1 to 3. Now, why did I put that? Well, let's go look at it. Okay, a grid column of 1 to 3. Not that there's 3 columns, but that it's going to span over both of these columns. 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. So we'll just say 1 to 3. We're going to do that same thing to the blue, because remember we want that one to span it as well. So I'm just going to copy this whole line and put it down here in the blue. Alright, so I'm going to give it a grid gap of 10 at first to see if that does the job. 10 pixels. Ooh, it's almost there. See, now we've got a little line, but the picture wants us to have more. So let's see if 20 does the job. That looks much better. But notice things they're not staying vertically aligned from the instructions. And I'm going to put it over here in the parent. All right, let's go look at it. And it looks spot on. And I'm going to bring this out away so we can look at it next to it. Now, you just solved a problem with grid. All right, let's go back over here. So we're going to solve this one by using margin. Okay, so we don't do anything to the red. We're going to put a margin here. So we're going to go minus 50, because it's 100 pixels wide. And we're going to go to the right, 0. We're going to go to the bottom, 0. And the only other way it's going to move is on the left, and we want it to go 50 pixels positive. Let's look at it and see how we did. Okay, those are overlapping. Remember, it's going to look like that, and it lined up perfectly. So now we just need to do that same thing to each of them, except the last number is going to get bigger by 50 each time. So it's going to go like this. I'm going to copy and paste this line to the yellow. And the only thing that's going to change is that this last one we need to go up 50 more pixels. So that would make this 100 pixels. And then we're going to go again to the blue. And we're going to go up 50 more pixels here. We don't do anything to the first one because it's already in the right spot. And that should make all of them look like this. So let's check it out. And indeed it does. They look the same. Well, that makes 2. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back and solve number 3 together. All right, welcome back. We're going to go with activity 3 now. And let's look at what this one needs to look like at the end. By clicking this. This would solve well also using grid. Looks like there's 2 columns. Now this one, since we're going to use grid, is going to have something up here in the parent column. And the very first thing it will have is display grid. It will also have the grid template columns of 1FR, 1FR, just like the other one did. And it will also have a grid gap. I'm just going to come up here to the top, and I'm going to borrow those 2 things so that I spell them right. It's going to have these 2 exact things. And I'm going to go down here to number 3. And I'm going to put them in the parent area. Make the red, change this to a % for the width. And the blue is also 100%. So I'm going to change pixel to % on those 2 items. 150 pixels for the yellow and the green. Right now they're at 100. I'm going to give it another 50 pixels, so they're a little bit taller. But the height doesn't change on the blue. And so let's do the grid. Remember, it's a 3-column or a 2-column grid, 2. But remember, that's the line here would be 1. Here in the middle, between the 2 columns would be 2, and then 3. So it's a span of 1 to 3, and that would be a grid column. So go back and borrow that from the first activity. Grid column 1 to 3. That way they'll stay in their places. Make sure you go back down to the correct one. All right, we're working on the red only. I'm going to paste it. Grid column 1 to 3. Same thing for the blue. But I would say these are like 100% of their column. So let's do that. We're going to change the width of the green and the yellow to 100% and see how that works. And we check it out. Ooh, it's 100% right, except for this gap. We're going to add that gap, and that'll give them a little separation. So let's go back over here, and we're going to go up to the parent, and we're going to give it a grid column gap. Now on the other one we just did grid gap, but that's so that it gave grid gap to everything. But we're only going to give a grid gap to the column. So I'm going to add that feature in. We're on activity 3. We're going to go grid column gap. And we want it to be, let's see if a 10% will work there. So I'm going to change this 20 pixels to 10%. And let's check it out. And these two look the same. So we've done 3 already. Let me take a quick break and we'll be back with number 4. Alrighty, I'm back. And this is what it's supposed to look like. This is also done in 2 columns. And there are 3 rows. Even though red doesn't have rows, it technically does. It just spans all 3 rows. And it spans halfway across. Alright, so let's go to our code. And our goal is to make it look like this. I call it a kind of a flag. I don't know what country that is, but we're going to go to number 4 to make sure we do it right. In there, it's got a height of 400 pixels. All right, so remember I said this is going to be a display grid. It's 2 columns, so that part will be the same. All right, so here we go. Okay, so we're going to borrow the display grid, the column. We're going to use grid gap, even though we're going to make it 0. And I'm going to put those down here in number 4, and then I'm going to change the amounts, not getting rid of height. So the display grid turns on the grid in the first place. Grid template columns tells it it's going to have 2 columns. The grid gap, there's none in between, so we're going to call it 0. And when you have 0, you don't have to put px, but any other time you have to put px. And this time we're going to do a grid template row, and we're going to make this like 33 1/3% for each. Alright, so now I have the parents set up. Remember, it's a height of 400. So the red needs to be 400 pixels high, and the width is going to be 100% of its column. And then we've got to name the column, and it's going from 1 to 2, not 1 all the way to 3. And we're also going to tell what row it is. And on this, it's going to span grid row 1 all the way to 3. Now notice it's singular. It's only plural up here in the parent. These are the individual children of this parent. So you only use singular. Like, I am Trish. You are Mary. He is Joe. And this one is going to go a grid row of 1 to 3. So let's see if we got the red right. Yeah? Now we just have to tell these children to be obedient. Their height is the 100 pixels, and their width is 100% of their column. 100% of the column, 100% of the row. And rather than write it each time, I can just copy this one that's right and do it on the yellow and the blue to replace what's there. It's okay, but this blue is still covering that, and that's okay. It made the yellow and the green be in their rightful place. So now we just need to tell it where they need to be. The grid column for the green, yellow, and blue is going to be 2 to 3 on all of them. 2 to 3. This one is going to be a row of 1 to 2. This one is going to be 2 to 3. And the last one, excuse me, is going to be 3 to 4. So let's go look at it, see how we did. And there we have a beautiful flag. Matches this one. Call this one a postage stamp, number 5. Let's see what it's supposed to look like. And you're going to be using something we haven't used yet. The idea is to make this text wrap around the green postage stamp. The red and the blue are all the way across. The yellow is actually all the way across also. It's just this sits on it and shares part of the space, but keeps the text from being underneath. Let's look at number 5, see what they already have in place. They have a height of 400, and we're not going to be using grid for this one of that, and we're going to make a max width. You could leave it at 4, but 600 makes it like not stretch out as bad. All right, so we're going to leave the height at 100% on the red and on the blue, but we're going to change the width to 100% on both of those. I'm going to first do the yellow and then I'm going to do the green. The width is also going to be 100%. All right, so far it's looking like this. We need to make the height of the yellow come all the way up here. So it looks like it's 200 tall. So the yellow needs to be 200 pixels. Let's try that. So what we need to do now is adjust the green. Now the green is a little bigger than just 100 by 100. So I'd say it's half again as big. So let's make it 150 for the height and the width. Okay, and we're going to tell it to float left, and that'll allow it to be on top. So I'm going to add a float left, because we want it to be on the left hand side. And that's number 5. All it took was a float. And we got one more to do. It's supposed to look like this when you are finished. It's going to be in grid. So over here, I'm going to do a display grid, number 6, parent. Just display grid. And also, I need to do the grid template rows. It can be done different ways. Keep in mind, there's usually more than one way to do something, but we're practicing grid because that's the way your first page is going to be. So I'm going to do grid template rows. And each one's going to be 100 pixels. All right, so we're going to do a column and a row for the red of 1 to 4. It's going to span between 1 and 4. And then we're going to do a grid row . 1 to 2. With a background color of red. Moved out of the way. There we go. So the green on this one is a grid column of 1 to 2. See, it's over here at the start, 1 and 2. And the rows on that would be like at the end, 5 and 6, probably. So I'm going to grab these two things and paste them in the green. This one is going to be a column of 1 to 2. And this is going to be a grid row of, I think, 5 to 6, because it's going down to 6. And I would say that the green is like 200 pixels wide and 200 pixels high. The red is more like 400. I think I said it, but I didn't change it. Make this 400 wide and 200 high. I made no grid gap. I gave Z index because on the hint it said use Z index, and that's what allows things to overlap like they are here. Like this one overlaps on here, so Z index of 1 for the red. 2 would be a Z index 2, or the blue. I made the green Z index 3, and then this one Z index 4. They both overlap, but it seemed to work the best. And then I adjusted the height and width of everything to be correct. And it was a matter of juggling the rows and columns. So this worked the best, so you could pause the film here and write in your code. And I know it was a hard one. I hope you have a good time with it. And we will be using this when we lay out our homepage in week 7. So pay attention to what's going on with each of these exercises, and happy coding.